Speaker, my message to the leader of the Conservatives is to be a little more economically literate. I guess he didn't.
Looks like Freeland's trying to mislead Canadians yet again. Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. For today's video, we're going to be taking a look at a little bit of what happened in the beginning of question period. And then we're going to transition into a video done by the CBC that came out a few days ago in regards to the Canadian dollar and our economy. The relevance of this is Trudeau just came out with this tax relief situation a few days ago. And Freeland today in a press conference tried to make it sound like sunshine and rainbows were on the way, yet this report from the CBC says otherwise. And while I was recording this, and another story just broke where Donald Trump has now announced that he will be putting 25% tariffs, not the 10 that he originally said, which again will tie into the video and have a great impact on Canada. And if you missed that announcement, here it is.
Make a start with some breaking news that's coming in. U.S. President-elect Donald Trump says one of his first orders of business once he takes office will be to start charging Canada and Mexico a 25% tariff on all goods coming into the U.S. Trump posting the threat on his Truth Social account. That's higher than the 10% he had warned on the campaign trail. He says it will be in place until borders are tightened.
Now we'll get a little bit more into why this is such a big deal, but as I mentioned, we're going to take a quick look at the beginning of question period and just hear the back and forth between Pierre and Freeland for a quick second.
The Honourable Leader of the Official Opposition.
After doubling housing costs and inflating food prices 37% faster in Canada than in the United States with inflationary carbon taxes and deficit spending, the Prime Minister now has a tiny 2-month tax trick that will save you 10 cents on a pack of chips, save you a few pennies on a Christmas tree, but only after your Christmas tree is already up and decorated. You'll even save on Halloween costumes 2 months after Halloween. Does he really expect Canadians to fall for this tiny tax trick just before he quadruples the carbon tax on heat, homes, gas, and groceries?
The Honourable Deputy Prime Minister and Minister of Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm really glad the Leader of the Opposition started by comparing our economic position with the U.S. Because the fact is, in Canada, inflation is lower. In Canada, interest rates are lower. In Canada, deficits are lower. And in Canada, the public debt is lower. Let's stop talking Canada down. And when it comes to supporting Canadians, what I want to know is, will Conservative MPs be allowed to offer a tax break to their constituents? I know their constituents want it. That's what we're hearing from everyone.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Mr. Speaker, this from a minister who, after finding out that the economy is entering its 6th consecutive quarter of shrinking per capita GDP, that's income per person down, while the American income per person is up. After she learned that there are 2 million people lined up at food banks, 38% more chronic homelessness, 1,400 homeless encampments in Ontario after 9 years of this government, she says we're not in a recession. We're in a vibe session, she says. So what's her message to people who are hungry and homeless after 9 years of her government? They just need to get with the vibe?
Exactly.
Now this vibe check that Pierre's talking about earlier before question period, Freeland, Duclos, and I forget the other minister for small businesses all had a little bit of a press conference. And this is what Freeland had to say about basically the economy.
A lot of economists have been talking about the vibe session and the fact that Canadians just aren't feeling good and that is having real economic consequences. And the Canadian economists making that point are right, that there is a disconnect between the real economic, the really positive economic news, the fact that the Canadian economy does appear set for a soft landing. That's good news, but Canadians aren't feeling it, and that is shaping their economic behavior in ways that are not great for the Canadian economy. People have been talking about a vibe session and how that is a challenge for the Canadian economy. One of the positive impacts of this measure is to help Canadians get past that vibe session, because how Canadians feel really does have a real economic impact.
So we've just heard that Trump is going to be putting higher tariffs. We just heard what happened at question period, and then we just heard what happened at the press conference. So now let's take a look at what the CBC is reporting.
The Canadian dollar is now at its lowest point since peak pandemic. Before that, the last time it fell below 72 cents US was almost a decade ago. And everyone we spoke to expects it's still got further to fall.
Wait a second. Did he just say a decade ago? Well, what happened there? Why don't we take a quick look? If we go back 10 years of our dollar value, back in 2014, before Trudeau's government got into power, the dollar was at 0.86. Then it started to drop, kind of maintained a little bit at the 80s. And then when Trudeau really got into power, it just started plummeting. And it has yet to ever get back up to this 86 mark that it once was. So very interesting that over a decade ago, and you can scroll down this timeline, you can see all the numbers above me. Here you get kind of back up to 80, 82, but never back up to that 86. And now we're just on a steady decline. As you're going to hear, people are estimating that we might even get down to under 70 cents, which is insane.
We've seen the losses essentially accelerate in recent weeks.
We are kind of expecting to move to like 69 cents in the next 3 to 6 months.
Canadians will feel that in their pocket.
Now look, maybe you're thinking, I have no plans to travel to the US. Why do I care? But even if you never leave your neighborhood, the exchange rate absolutely affects you. So let's go through how, starting with how the dollar fell so low in the first place. There are a few things that go into how the value of a currency is determined, but at its core, it's about supply and demand. If people or businesses around the world want to buy products, stocks, or real estate from a country, they typically need that country's currency to do so. That increases demand for the currency and can drive up its value.
The exchange rate is the price of one currency in terms of another. And so if you need US currency, that's going to drive up the value of the US dollar, which means then, relatively speaking, the Canadian dollar is going to weaken.
Now, an important thing to note is the part that they're about to get into next actually counters everything that Freeland just finished saying in the House of Commons today during question period. And that economist Moshe, we're going to be seeing a little bit more of him because not only was he part of the CBC report, he actually was interviewed after the announcement that Trump will be increasing the tariffs to 25%, and he kind of gets into a little bit of that. With that being said, let's get back to the CBC report.
Generally, there are two big selling features that make investors want to put their money into one country over another. One is if they believe that country's economic outlook is trending in the right direction. If the American economy is doing well, you might buy American stocks, right? And right now, there's a pretty big difference between the Canadian and American economies.
One of the stark divergences we see in Canada versus the US is, number one, the economies are moving in two different ways.
For example, the unemployment rate in the US is about 4%. In Canada, it's been creeping up. Now it's 6.5%. GDP growth last quarter was close to 3% in the US. In Canada, it was around 1%. And the debt to income ratio in the United States, that's how much of your gross monthly income goes to paying debt, is around 100%. In Canada, it's 180%.
Now, this is a prime example of how the liberals think you're stupid and Chrystia Freeland tried to pull the wool over your eyes. Because if you remember during the earlier clip with question period, she thanked Pierre for bringing up the comparison between the US and Canada, and then she listed four major things: interest, inflation, deficit, and the public debt, and said that Canada is doing better in all of those aspects.
Mr. Finance.
Mr. Speaker, I'm really glad the Leader of the Opposition started by comparing our economic position with the U.S. Because the fact is, in Canada, inflation is lower. In Canada, interest rates are lower. In Canada, deficits are lower. And in Canada, the public debt is lower. Let's stop talking Canada down.
That is true. But you need to remember that we are basically almost a tenth of the population of the US. We are just slightly bigger than California, one of their states, in terms of our population versus the US population. And if we're doing so well, why are these numbers that the CBC just reported so drastic? Why, during the rest of this report, is it going to state how bad we are in comparison to them?
Yes, that means more debt than income. You get the point. Economy's unequal. But the other big reason investors might want to put money into a particular country is when it's got high interest rates.
If like an international investor has money to invest in either Canada or US, all else equal, they'll gravitate to where the interest is higher because they earn more.
And so that's unquestionably at this point in the United States.
Canada has been cutting rates over and over again since the summer, trying to kickstart a stalling economy. Meanwhile, in the US, with a much stronger economy, their rates haven't moved as much.
In Canada, interest rates are lower.
So far, they've only cut 0.75 of a percentage point off their policy rate to Canada's 1.25 percentage point.
Well, we don't have to move in lockstep with each other. We tend to, but on this particular occasion, we haven't.
Now, there were signs that the US was going to start cutting interest rates more aggressively too, which would, in theory, help take some pressure off the Canadian dollar. But just a few weeks ago, the entire economic landscape changed. President-elect Donald Trump has a very different economic plan than Joe Biden. He's promised to slash taxes, deregulate, boost spending, and put in some pretty hefty tariffs. All of that has markets predicting a boost in growth.
The market's reaction to Donald Trump's victory has been pretty dramatic.
The loonie, like just about every other currency, was down against the US dollar.
What his platform is very nationalistic, pro-growth, pro-US growth.
And so that's the type of thing then that's going to make people want to put their money into US shares and into US investments. And so in order to do that, you need US currency.
And this new reality prompted the head of the Federal Reserve to signal that US interest rates may stay higher for longer than anticipated, meaning that gap between Canadian and American interest rates is now expected to widen even more, sending the Canadian dollar even lower.
In Canada, interest rates are lower.
The US dollar is uniquely strong right now because just 2 months ago we were pricing in rapid US rate cuts. And now the market has turned around and said maybe they'll only cut, a 0.5 point, 0.75 of a point over the next year, whereas Canada might cut by 0.5 point next month.
All of that is accelerating what we're seeing in the currency markets and helping to drive the loonie lower.
Now, I gotta say, guys, this one's a bit of a tough one. I'm not sure who to believe. Do I believe Chrystia Freeland, who doesn't know what the hell she's talking about when it comes to finances, or all these economists? Because if we check out Chrystia Freeland a few months ago on her Twitter page, she wrote, "Good news, the Bank of Canada is cutting interest rates again. We are now the first G7 country to cut rates 4 times in a row. This is important relief for Canadians and Canadian businesses. It means more money in your pocket, including when renewing your mortgage." And then she plays this little video of the interest rate dropping down to 3.75%. Yet, if we look at some of these comments, emergency rate cuts are not a good news item. Last time this happened was during COVID. How can a finance minister be so dense? This is not good news. What is wrong with you? Our finance minister is publicly proud of 4 consecutive rate cuts, which pretty much confirms the impending recession. There hasn't been a worse time for Canadians in the last 20 years, and you're tweeting this shit. Again, she is so out of touch, but they love to quote economists when it comes to the carbon tax, but now they don't believe the economists when it comes to proving them wrong? Well, let's continue and see what else they're wrong about.
But a weak Canadian dollar can also have much bigger impacts at home. Impacts that are also much trickier to avoid.
So anybody walking around with an iPhone right now, or anybody who's buying fruits and vegetables at the local grocery store, is probably importing it from the US.
Next time you buy a book in Canada, take a look at the back, and often the price you'll see is in both Canadian and US dollars. It's a pretty good reminder of just how much more Canadians pay for the exact same product. My producer bought this book a few years ago when the dollar was in a better place. There's about a 26% difference between the US and Canadian prices. But if you bought a brand new book published today with the Canadian dollar at about 71 cents US, you could be paying around 40% more. Now, extrapolate that out to everything Canada imports from the US, which is hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods each year, and you can start to see how hard it becomes to escape the impact.
In Canada, interest rates are lower.
And so you could find that all of a sudden the food prices, technology prices, or anything that you're buying from the US has now gone up in Canadian dollar terms.
But it's the impact on businesses, especially smaller businesses, that worries the economists that we spoke to most. Say your family runs a corner store in Hamilton, and a few years ago, you budgeted around $5 a pint to import California strawberries. But as the dollar's gotten weaker and weaker, you're now paying the equivalent of about $6 a pint. So what do? Well, you could pass the extra cost onto the consumer by raising prices. The problem with that is if you jack up your prices, you could risk losing your customers to big box grocers like Loblaws or Sobeys, because those big box grocers can usually prepare for these kinds of fluctuations. They've got bigger supply networks, so maybe they import from Chile instead of California. They're also able to negotiate set prices for produce, sometimes a full year out. So they can often keep the price of their strawberries relatively steady.
If you're smaller and you're more local, you're kind of at the whim of all the things that you can't control. You can't hedge.
So depending on how long this lasts, it really could do some damage, especially to smaller Canadian businesses that are very reliant on American inputs.
So it doesn't sound good for small businesses, especially in Canada, yet the Liberal government would like you to think otherwise, because in today's press conference, they stated that small businesses are going to be thriving and booming with this Liberal government's GST tax relief that they're going to be implementing for the next 2 months.
There are some good underlying economic developments, economic indicators. It's really important for Canadians to start feeling that confidence and to act on that confidence.
And I just wanted to add 2 points from the perspective of small business. As an entrepreneur myself, we heavily rely on the Christmas holiday season for sales for the year. But one of the challenges is right after the holiday season is over, there's this lull, and it feels like a crash come January. These supports are really going to help small business drive foot traffic into their doors that they never had right after the holiday season. And that's significantly going to help. And I just want to state facts with the Restaurants Canada. They indicated that this GST tax break could mean up to 5% of a boost in sales. That's a $1 billion additional revenue that restaurants can receive as a result of these changes. So that's positive for small businesses and, of course, for our economy.
Okay, whatever you say, let's get back to the CBC report.
Inputs, meaning everything from the machinery a business uses to the parts that they're sourcing to the staff that they hire.
Sometimes Canadian businesses just decide the best way to avoid this problem is to leave entirely.
And here's the real kicker. What happens over time when things become more and more expensive?
A weaker Canadian dollar means you import more inflation.
That's right, inflation. Something we're already starting to see sneaking its way back into our lives.
Because the fact is, in Canada, inflation is lower.
Canadians having just gotten over inflation, starting to reckon with cost of living affordability issues, might find that these things start to creep back again. And it might actually force the Bank of Canada to slow down the interest rate cuts, pause the interest rate cuts, or worst case scenario, even start increasing interest rates again to try and keep inflation from rearing its head again. How many Americans are now going to look at Banff or Mont-Tremblant or the Atlantic Canadian provinces and say, man, I always wanted to travel there. Now is a great time to do it because my American money is going to travel really far in Canada.
This same logic also applies to anything made in Canada that's sold to the US at Canadian prices. With a low Canadian dollar, important Canadian products like oil, auto parts, lumber, they also become cheaper and more attractive to Americans. So in theory, exports could grow
So you have your car manufacturers, your steel, a lot of heavy manufacturing. If you're a US company looking to buy goods, all of a sudden you'll look more at Canada now because it's cheaper for you to do.
But here's the thing. If Trump follows through on his promise to put a 10% tariff on international goods, Canadian products will suddenly become a lot more expensive, which could completely cancel out the benefits of a lower dollar. In fact, according to economists at TD, we could actually see a net 5% reduction in Canadian exports to the US in the next couple of years.
If any country in North America is tariff or negotiated or carved out of the US supply chain, you are essentially losing access to one of the world's most productive and efficient and biggest markets.
It's a bit of a moment when it's the worst of both worlds for Canada with a weaker currency.
And so, currency traders are taking a much more skeptical view on where the Canadian dollar is going.
Now, everyone we spoke to said maybe the most concerning thing about a Canadian dollar that struggles against the US dollar is what it says about Canada. It's a lack of confidence. So the prospect of falling even further below 70 cents US, as many are predicting, it could be an issue.
Now, on top of these issues that potentially are on the way, we also have, as we saw earlier, Trump announcing the 25% tariffs. Now, Moshe, as I said, he went on CTV to talk a little bit about it, and it doesn't sound good for the Canadian economy in the near future.
Let's get your reactions on this story. We have with us economist Moshe Lander. Moshe, good evening and thank you for joining us. Appreciate your time.
Hello.
So this is a major shift in policy and what we have heard so far. Donald Trump now saying it's not about 10 or 20%, but 25% on all goods coming in from Canada. But if this were to go ahead with a 25% tariff on all Canadian goods being sent across to the United States, in your view, how hard is this going to be for the Canadian economy? What sort of a hit are we talking about here?
It's substantial. We're very proud that the U.S. is our biggest trade partner. But if all of a sudden there's an extra 25% that's being added to it, then at what point does that lead to a decrease in the demand for Canadian goods and services? And once that decrease is sustained, does that lead to job losses? Does that lead to a recession that we managed to avoid over the last 4 years, despite all of the problems that we've had on this side of the border of our own doing? And so if there's unemployment, that's the last thing that we need at this point. And it's the last thing that this government needs. They're in a fight for their political life. It looks like they're probably going to lose. This could be the type of thing, though, that if you remember the last time that these two met, it didn't end well. Trump left Quebec City saying very nasty things about the prime minister, calling him names, and calling Canadians names in the process, too.
Let me ask you about if we break it down, because this is not, people had thought, experts had thought maybe oil and gas perhaps could be exempted. But in this case, if this was to be everything like we're discussing and what his post is saying at the moment, what would this mean directly for the consumers here in Canada? Ultimately, what are we going to face? Because it's going to boil down to the consumers eventually.
Yeah, so it's interesting what happens with consumers at that point, because if Americans aren't looking to buy our goods and services, then that's a major source of demand that disappears. So it could actually lead to price reductions in this country, because if the only ones that are looking to buy our stuff is us, then without that inflationary pressure coming from the U.S., there is the possibility that that could be good news for us. The problem, though, is that the Canadian dollar would lose value. And if it loses value, then the stuff that we're buying from the U.S. would actually go up in Canadian dollar prices. Think about buying those iPhones or any other gifts you're thinking of with the holidays coming. All of a sudden, those would be more expensive in Canadian. So it really does balance out. But then it depends on how long this lasts, because at some point, those weak Canadian dollar effects could offset the lack of Canadian demand effects, and it could become inflationary.
Because the fact is, in Canada, inflation is lower.
Leave it to the Liberals to just gaslight the Canadian population. But hey guys, this is just my opinion as always. I'd love to hear from you guys. Let me know in the comment section below what you thought about all this. If you did make it to the end of the video, let me know. Type in green eggs and ham or something like that. And as always, I will catch you guys on the next one.